Hi everyone, Adam from RethinkX here. Thanks for joining me. Since there was a great response to the video I published a couple of weeks ago about nuclear power, I thought I'd continue with some more myth-busting today. This time around a particularly bad idea, the idea that less energy, less transportation, less food, less labor is a solution to our problems. It's not. So let's dive right in. The idea of less is an old one. In fact, it dates back thousands of years to classical antiquity. It's the general idea that many of our problems, as both individuals and as a society, are the result of being overindulgent, and that if only we could tighten our belts, be less profligate, lazy, materialistic, greedy, if only we could be more frugal, more careful, more content and grateful for what we have, etc., 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 then that would solve all of our problems. It's an archaic and emotional way of thinking, but it's been part of many schools of thought throughout the ages. And today, it's the basis of the degrowth movement and its ideology. Part of my training as an environmental scientist included what you might call introduction to the degrowth mindset. Well, frankly, it was at the very least inculcation, if not outright indoctrination. I took courses as a master's student, and ultimately I taught courses as a PhD student that covered all of the tenets of degrowth. So I'm very familiar with the ecological economics and political ecology and environmental justice literatures and so on, the literatures that the degrowth doctrine pulls concepts from. And don't get me wrong, there are lots and lots of other very important and valid ideas that come out of those subdisciplines. But the degrowth ideology cherry-picks those literatures, as all ideologies do, to tell a very specific story. And I'm ashamed to say, it took me far too long, years, to see how bogus that story really is. Well, like any ideology, there's a large constellation of precepts and assumptions within the degrowth orthodoxy. And most of those are pretty esoteric and haven't made their way into mainstream environmental discourse. So I'm not going to dismantle every little detail of them here. I can tackle them in future videos if a lot of people request it. But for today, I'll just focus on the central idea, the idea of less. And that really has become entrenched in modern environmentalism. And although I've touched on some of this in previous videos, it's worth repeating for emphasis. The bottom line is that it won't work. It will actually make things worse. Okay, so why? Why won't degrowth work? Why won't cutting back 50 or 75 or 90% on our impacts solve climate change? Well, it's because it's not enough. One analogy I often use to explain why is a house on fire. If your house is burning, less fire isn't a solution. Putting out 50 or 75 or 90% of the flames isn't enough. Your house is still on fire. To actually solve the problem, you have to put out all of the flames, and fast. Okay, so the flames are emissions in this analogy. How does degrowth get you to net zero? It can't. You can't cut economic production and consumption to zero and still have a civilization. So doing less, the central pillar of degrowth, cannot get us to net zero emissions. It is logically impossible. But it doesn't stop there. Because even once the flames are out, in our burning building analogy, even once emissions are net zero, you are not done. You still need to repair all of the damage to the atmosphere and oceans that you've already done. And degrowth doesn't repair anything. just like hosing water on the flames of a burning building doesn't fix any of the damage from the fire. So again, the idea of less is not a solution. It's logically impossible. So that's why degrowth just won't work. But it gets worse, because the economic productivity undermined by doing less is the very thing you need in order to repair past environmental damage, to restore ecosystems, reforest landscapes, clean up polluted rivers and soils, withdraw carbon from the atmosphere and oceans. Less economic productivity, less energy and transportation and food and other goods and services, less abundance and prosperity. They only make solving climate change and other big problems harder. Harder, not easier. And it doesn't stop there. It gets even worse. Because less economic activity, less abundance and prosperity causes its own problems. Huge problems. The COVID-19 pandemic, for example, caused the greatest global economic disaster since the Great Depression. And it did so by temporarily reducing economic production and consumption by only 3.5%. And as always, the poorest and the most vulnerable among us were hit the hardest by that. So just imagine a 50 or 75 or 90% reduction permanently. Now, it's true that today we measure economic activity with crude tools like GDP, and these are rightly criticized, not just by the degrowth orthodoxy, but by many others. We at Rethink X have our own concerns about GDP as a meaningful metric, but the larger point stands. Even if a small temporary reduction in economic activity can create major social and geopolitical problems, then it is sheer lunacy to think that massive, permanent reductions will result in anything but utter catastrophe. And to top it all off, there's the additional irony that environmental concerns go right out the window, as they always do whenever serious social and political problems arise. Now that simple, straightforward reasoning alone is more than enough to sink degrowth completely. But there are a few more details about the idea of less that are worth quickly unpacking. First, the idea of less assumes that a lot of our use of energy, transportation, and food is indeed wasteful. But is it? Sure, we can all think of examples in our own personal lives and in society where waste occurs. It's wasteful to leave the lights on in an empty room. It's wasteful to drive a car when a few minutes walk could get you there just as easily. It's wasteful to go to all of the trouble of growing crops and raising animals just to throw half of your food in the trash at the end of a meal. But this all begs a couple of important questions. One is, how much of our energy, transportation, and food waste, and there is waste, how much is actually avoidable? Can we avoid 10% of the waste we have? Or 50%? Or 90%? If we were maximally efficient, how much energy, transportation, and food could we really save? How much of our global economy goes to avoidable waste? I'm not aware of any rigorous attempts to quantify this, but it certainly isn't 90% or even 50%. Next, the idea of less presumes that some things are necessary while others are wasteful. But that begs the question, who gets to decide? And boy, that's a slippery slope. Does anybody actually need to wear perfume or jewelry? Drink wine or beer? Go to the movies? Or scuba dive? From a certain point of view, most of the global economy, most of our modern standard of living, consists precisely of those unnecessary luxuries. They are the difference between living and just surviving. Next, and closely related, the idea of less moralizes consumption. Luxuries are decadent, whereas frugality is virtuous. Bad people consume more, while good people consume less, and so on. One problem with this thinking is that it falsely lumps all goods and services together. Is it virtuous for society to consume less education or less healthcare? Okay, well then why less energy? Is energy less beneficial, less pure, less virtuous than education? Sweeping generalizations get us into trouble. And besides, what are the realistic policy options here? Outlaw goods and services deemed immoral by some clergy or committee? History has shown us, again and again, the folly of trying to dictate personal choices. Prohibition has always been a recipe for disaster. Next, there's the assumption that we ought to consume less energy and transportation and food because they are bad. But are they? A moment's reflection shows that their unwanted side effects are the real problem. Energy isn't bad. Electricity and heat are good. It's greenhouse gas emissions that are bad. Transportation isn't bad. Mobility is good. It's air pollution and traffic congestion that are bad. Food isn't bad. Nutrition and variety is good. It's deforestation and animal suffering that are bad. It's the unwanted side effects that advocates of less are really trying to minimize. And the mistake there is a category error, or you could think of it as a fallacy of composition. It's falsely assuming that the whole has the same properties as the parts. Basically, it's the mistake of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Next, and directly related, is the false assumption that we can't decouple the good from the bad, the benefits of energy, transportation, and food from their harms. So even when you point out this fallacy of composition error above, advocates for less will often reply, well, we can't separate the good from the bad, the benefits from the harms. They'll sometimes invoke the Jevons paradox to argue that unwanted side effects will only get worse, never better. But the data clearly show that this is false. Just as one quick example, digital technology today lets us capture millions of times more images than we ever could with film cameras. But those unwanted side effects of celluloid film, which is a pretty dirty business, haven't gotten worse. They've almost totally disappeared. Why? Because we decoupled photographs and videos from celluloid film. And we can do exactly the same thing with the side effects that we don't want from energy, transportation, and food. We aren't stuck with coal power plants, combustion engine vehicles, or animal farming, just like we weren't stuck with celluloid film. We can decouple the benefits from their harmful side effects by switching to better, cleaner technology. Okay, so back to degrowth for just a minute. One last dirty trick that ideologies often do is rope us in with uncontroversial claims so that we don't notice all the crazy stuff coming along for the ride. The degrowth movement is no exception here. So, if you're for fair trade and more equality, great. If you're for reducing waste and for more responsible consumption, well, great. If you're for environmental cleanup and ecological restoration, great. The thing is, everyone is for those things. It's like saying you're for health instead of disease. Who isn't? But, if you believe we can solve climate change by riding bicycles to work, taking shorter showers, and just not eating meat on Mondays, well, you're crazy. If you believe we can solve climate change by burning capitalism to the ground and hoping something better rises from the ashes, well, you're crazy. And if you think we can solve climate change by further dividing people and nations into haves and have-nots, or along the lines of global north and global south, instead of uniting and elevating all of humanity through abundance and prosperity, well, you're crazy. So what's the upshot of all of this? It's simple. Don't let anyone tell you that the solution is less. Instead, help accelerate the disruptions. That's the way forward. And do so with your voice, with your vote, and with your wallet. The sooner humanity shifts to clean energy, transportation, and food, the sooner we can achieve the abundance and prosperity we need to really solve climate change. Well, that's it for today. As always, hit those like and subscribe buttons for us. There are links to the book and Rethink X's other publications in the description. Thanks everyone for watching, and just remember, the future is brighter than you think. We'll see you all next time. Take care.